Hello, I'm Sean Lay. Welcome to our weekly roundtable discussion between BBC specialists and the foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast to audiences in their home countries from the Dateline London. With us this week, Latika Burke, a columnist for two Australian newspapers, The Age in Melbourne and the Sydney Morning Herald. Justin Rowlatt, the BBC's climate editor, and Geoffrey Kaufman. Geoffrey is an experienced foreign correspondent and has been a news anchor for both Canadian and US broadcasters. First of all, lovely to have the three of you in the studio with me. I keep saying this every week and I'm going to keep saying it. It makes such a difference. Welcome back to all of you. Now, socialism, according to a British politician of the last century, is the language of priorities. Perhaps it's more accurate to say that politics in a democracy is about choosing between priorities. What happens, though, when those priorities conflict? No one accused of war crimes in Ukraine today will face justice anytime soon. So Ukraine's allies are punishing Russia with further sanctions. Some want to stop buying Russian gas altogether, but that could mean shortages, bills higher than they are already, rationing. Substitution means more carbon extraction, just as the United Nations is warning that the world is way off the greening of energy needed to prevent the climate perhaps becoming, for us, intolerable. The response of Boris Johnson's government has been an energy security strategy. Justin, sustainability, affordability, security of supply. What does this strategy tell us about where Boris Johnson's government's priorities lie?
Well, it's claiming that it's hitting all those priorities. So it's claiming that it addresses all of that. I think, the consensus has been that it hasn't done that particularly well, hasn't hit any of them particularly well. So we're talking about new nuclear power, we're talking about a more rapid, we're already rolling out offshore wind very rapidly, a more rapid rollout of offshore wind. Tiny changes to onshore wind, maybe a little bit more solar, and then opening up new licensing for gas in the North Sea, gas and oil in the North Sea. What there wasn't was a big effort to kind of tackle demand, reduce demand, perhaps insulate homes, maybe get people to switch to heat pumps, that kind of stuff. Greens were very upset about that. So, look, it takes a long time to build nuclear power. It takes 4 years to build wind turbines in the North Sea. It'd be much quicker to put onshore wind turbines, and that would address the energy security more quickly, would also arguably reduce bills more quickly. So in a sense, it didn't really, it had those three priorities at its heart, but didn't really address any of them.
So it's kept them all kind of juggling
them all, but
I think Boris Johnson is saying to the people of the United Kingdom, take a cold shower for 10 years while we fix this. I really do. I think it's really shocking. My own energy bills have gone up over 100%. I'm sure that that's a pretty common story across the nation. It is. My heart breaks to think of people who are living on the margins and what this is doing to them, let alone businesses that survive on the margins with vast restaurants or factories that need to be heated now at these prices. And what's he doing for them? Where is that? How are they going to survive?
Is it so surprising, though, that for an elected politician to say to voters, not only are you going to have to pay more, which you're already doing now, but you're going to have to use less? It's not a vote-winning message.
But the request was, from green groups and environmentalists, was to say, listen, subsidise people to make their homes more efficient. Make it easier for them, make it cheaper for them to put insulation, make it cheaper. There are significant cost hurdles to putting in insulation. And, given the, historic energy prices, actually, for many people, it's been a tough decision to make because it takes many, many, many years to pay off. The current energy prices, the argument's a little bit more difficult. But that was the argument. Let's make the homes more efficient, reduce demand, decrease the dependency on foreign fuel.
And Europe has done this. The United Kingdom has, by some standards, the least, in Western Europe at least, the least insulated, protected home stock in the region, and therefore
we like drafts.
We like drafts. We all know that. We've all been there, haven't we? Those lovely old Georgian homes. Yeah.
They do say Britain is has the draftiest homes. I've never been able to pin that statistic down. Find out what it actually means.
Latika, Australia has experienced energy politics and the rough and tumble at the last election, where it looked like the Conservative, small c Conservative, i.e. the Liberal National Coalition was going to lose, yet it won, and it appeared to win because what Labour was saying on energy, the voters just didn't like. Can you remind us of that, and is that still going to play this time round?
Well, Sean, not even just the last election, the last decade in Australia, basically all the elections have been written by this climate change politics orthodoxy that's been going on. And I don't expect that's going to change too much this election. However, what we have for the first time is a bipartisan commitment for net zero by 2050. The incumbent government, the centre-right government led by Scott Morrison, was very reluctantly dragged, kicking and screaming to that position by Boris Johnson actually at COP last year in Glasgow. And so we have that bipartisanship. What we don't have necessarily is the consensus about how to get there. And then along comes what we have in Ukraine and Russia, really actually making people think, gee, maybe we didn't go all in with the green movement straight away. And maybe that's actually a good thing for us. Because if you look carefully at what a lot of the people who are maligned sometimes, or perhaps more accurately called as climate deniers in Australia, many of them within the current government, they have always actually said, we want to transition, but with technology, not via taxes, not with trading schemes. Now that seems to be coming into fruition for them. So I think we will, to answer your question, have some climate politics running through this next election. But I think what we're going to see is that more morphing into a story about adaptation to climate change, which is already very much alive in Australia, and also the cost of living.
Does that mean less extraction? Is that ever going to be feasible for Australian politicians to argue for? Because it is suggested that's really what Labour was acknowledging would have to happen at the last election, and it paid a big electoral price for that.
Well, the current Labor leader, Anthony Albanese, has come out very strongly saying that coal will be a part of Australia's future. So I think that's the answer to your question. Does that mean that we're going to be doing what some in the current government would like, which is funding with taxpayer dollars new coal power fire stations? No, I don't think so. But you do see both sides coming to the table in a more centrist way that they have not been able to for a decade.
But there's such a paradox here because you've had these terrible floods. I mean, and then of course before that, those incredible bushfires. I mean, Australia in a way is a barometer of climate change, probably one of the most one of the countries most affected by climate at the moment. And yet there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of energy. You say there's a consensus to 2050. They're cutting the money that they're spending on the transition at the moment. I mean, they did it very recently, didn't they?
I think it's very difficult for people outside to Australia to understand what a big deal it is to have a Conservative government that has been ripped apart. They have changed prime ministers more times now than I can remember over this very issue. To have a Conservative prime minister able to stand up and say, we're going to go net zero by 2050, and he's still in the job and contesting this next election, that is huge for Australia.
Justin, with all these pressures, it's in the energy security strategy from the UK. We have this debate coming up in an imminent general election, probably next month in Australia. Where does this leave our ambitions, the stated global ambition for mitigating the effects of climate change and indeed trying to prevent the very worst of it?
It's so interesting because you hinted at it in your introduction. There was a UN publication, the IPCC, the kind of climate change group within the UN, published their report on mitigation, on tackling climate change at the beginning of this week. And what's interesting, it said we need to transition away from fossil fuels as quickly as we can, essentially. What's interesting about these reports, which often people don't kind of bang home, don't recognise, these are signed up by the governments of the world. So they're written by scientists, and then there's a couple of weeks where the governments and the scientists get together and kind of wrestle through the words and kind of, strike through some of the stuff and change the wording a little bit, maybe water it down. But at the end of the day, those conclusions were signed up by and we're talking Saudi Arabia, Australia, everybody signed up to this. So in a sense, this week we saw consensus, world consensus, that this is a really serious problem, that we're heading for really, really serious difficulties unless we urgently accelerate the decarbonisation of the world economy, not individual economies, the world economy. And yet, when you look on an individual basis, you just don't see the action that we need.
And one of the richest countries in the world, too, and with a small population.
But I would add 2 points there. One is that in Australia, you'll often hear this refrain, it's no good, and I'm not saying I agree with this, but this is a very persuasive argument in Australia. It's no good us acting. We're a fairly tiny country proportionally. If China and India and Brazil and all these other major polluters don't come to the table,
and if
we're just crippling
like
our own
who've
economy.
Been dragging us to the table, then say, but you have to allow an exception for us because we've got this war going on in Ukraine. We have to punish Russia. Are we doing ourselves any favours, Jeffrey, in punishing Russia? Long term, isn't there a danger we're going to say to a country that is absolutely dependent on its export revenue from
Oh my gosh! We just did a 90-degree turn of this conversation, or maybe 180 degrees.
It's an
listen, I think that the morality of what is behind the sanctions against Russia is a separate morality from climate change. They are both morality questions, but I think a kind of wholesale slaughter of a nation.
But that's not my point. Is it the danger that if you say to a country like Russia that this is its one key export, we're going to stop using you, we're phasing you out, regardless of what happens in Ukraine, it's over. That country then has more incentive to gain more client energy-dependent vassal states.
Are you saying they're going to invade other countries?
I'm not saying anything. I'm asking you that question.
I think, Sean, I don't think I can separate the sanctions from the reasons for the sanctions. Yeah. And so I think the question is an interesting one, but I'm uncomfortable trying to separate the two, because I think for most of us there is a very direct connection, and which I know we're going to talk about this in a moment, so I won't get ahead. But there are long-term impacts. Russia has a huge reserve of oil and it really doesn't have much industry. Let's face it; it's a petro economy. And so, yes, there will be consequences, but I think that we have to deal with the immediate humanitarian urgency.
We'll come back to that. A perfectly fair point. Justin, the political clout which comes from having energy supply, one way or another, is going to shift, isn't it? It's already shifting from the Middle East. Maybe not fast enough for some liking, but it's shifting. Russia, potentially, if we're following this through and Europe follows through on its promises. Where's it going to go? Who are going to be the new energy titans?
Well, listen, let's see who occupies that space. I think that's really interesting. I think, look,
really good question.
If the UN is right, what the UN says is we're essentially at peak carbon. We need to peak before 2025, is what the UN IPCC report said. Before 2025, the next 2 or 3 years, right? So we're at peak carbon. We're at the point at which this reorganisation of world power happens. Let me put it to you, Latika. Australia could be that energy superpower by, putting wind turbines.
To be fair, Latika is not the afraid commissioner.
No, but I'm saying there is a
huge
opportunity out there, which frankly, actually, Boris Johnson has recognised and is saying, look, we've got a unique access to continental shelf in a really windy part of the world. We're going to put wind turbines out there and we'll be exporting energy, was part of what he said. You could be doing the same.
But I think actually the answer, that's partly the answer to Sean's question. It's a really interesting question. Who will be the energy power, these oil states of in 20 years? I think the answer is it's technology. The people who create the technology that supplies energy. We're talking about wind. We're talking about solar.
It's not just technology. There is also there are places which
is also technology.
Yes, but this is one of the big, I think, real promises and potential. And actually, Justin, Australia should have been a renewable superpower 10, 20 years ago. We should have had solar farms in the desert
as well.
Right.
Britain failed to do that.
But what we are now doing is we have a government that has always said, well, we're technology agnostic about how we get to net zero. And what they are backing, they're not really technology agnostic, they're pouring huge subsidies into green hydrogen. And there is a huge hope in Australia that we will become a green hydrogen exporter that will supply Asia, potentially even Europe, and you should really watch out for announcements on this between Britain and Australia. And if that is the case, what you will see is, wrapping into this whole conversation about Ukraine, a retilting of supply lines, a retilting of energy security, so that we are trading energy with people we like, we trust, and we know are not going to go and invade other countries.
But I think that is part of the equation. But Elon Musk is now building solar panels for your roof that can power your home. It's impossible not to believe that a big part of the equation is going to be that, particularly for new build homes or homes that have a specific design that can be retrofitted. I think when you talk about the powerhouses, that kind of technology, once it becomes affordable, right now it's a wealthy person's game, but let's bring the price down.
I think that's really interesting, because the other thing people don't tend to recognise is what we're also seeing is an electrification of the world. As we move away from gas and oil, we're seeing an electrification. And once you do that, once you've got a heat pump in your house, heating your house, and you've got a car outside with a big battery, and you've got a solar panel on your roof, the three of them can work together to maximise your energy efficiency and minimise your use of the grid. So in a way, it massively potentially decentralises power.
One of the things that came out as a result of discussions about this strategy and the coverage of it is the suggestion from the government that by 2028, half of all new cars sold have to be fully electric, not even dual, they have to be fully electric. Tesla, since you mentioned them, have done a deal with, I think, New Caledonia in the Pacific region, tiny, tiny territory, but happens to have 1/10 of the world's nickel. And suddenly everybody is going to need nickel because of the batteries. I mean, presumably all of those factors, you say who owns the technology, could be governments, or at least governments license technology. That is going to give them political clout.
Yeah, I mean, rare earth minerals is a huge issue for Australia. We've been striking deals all around because we're very, very sensitive to China's ownership of this, and we're trying to get our own self-sufficiency. And actually, it's something that we're trying to do with a lot of Asian countries, including India, which anyone watching this space knows that India is more than happy to go up and buy Russian gas at the moment, which is being sold at bargain basement prices to them. And that's very concerning for a country like Australia, because we see a country like India as our potential strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific. So all of this is related. And if Australia can crack energy security, it can crack climate change and bring down our emissions, it can also crack global security and on something that matters for us so much in our region, which is, of course, a hedge on China.
Has this accelerated, do you think, this focus on energy security, the transition, do you think?
Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear what everybody else says. It seems to me that it is balanced, because on the one hand, you know, the retreat immediately in a moment like this, with energy prices soaring, would be to traditional sources of energy, to kind of coal. We've seen a lot more coal in Germany, for example, coal, gas and oil. And not necessarily, because renewables take a while to go in. But in the longer term, I think it's made countries around the world think, hold on a second, you know, there is now a way to decouple from these, I
think that's exactly right. I think that, and I think that's the good news. I think, I don't want to get ahead of our discussion, but I think in the short term, we're seeing some of the old stuff being extended. Nuclear power is back. You know, the nature of the discussion has changed in the last 6 weeks, and really
because of what's happening in Ukraine, because of Russia.
Putin has really changed the way we perceive energy supply and energy security.
And actually, Germany, I mean, it's incredible. In Germany, they've mothballed their nuclear power stations. They're now saying they're going to bring some of them back out and start using it. That is how dramatic this change has been. I think this is going to be, I mean, this, for all sorts of reasons, is such an incredibly interesting moment.
And I hate to be the doom and gloom here, but I think we do need to be a bit more realistic about what's going to happen in the immediate term. And I think that will actually grow a more acceptable political framework for using fossil fuels in the immediate short term. So a good example of this is one of the humanitarian things Australia has done is send tens of thousands of tonnes of coal, humanitarian coal, we're calling it, to Ukraine. And now nobody is actually saying that's a bad thing.
Nobody's called them out on it, no.
Well, no, why would you? Because Ukraine urgently needs
and you're
energy.
Doing it to help
We're
people.
sending them humanitarian coal. And actually, when President Zelensky
it's brilliant
addressed...
PR, that, isn't it?
Well,
it's not dirty fuel, it's humanitarian.
But this is where it gets really interesting, because Scott Morrison, who very infamously went into the Australian Parliament with a lump of coal in his hand saying, don't be scared of it, Labor Party, he gets up and welcomes Zelensky to give his address to the Parliament and says, and you've got our bullets, you've got our prayers, you've got our coal. And everyone kind of in Australia went, oh, that was a bit political, because coal is a very political term in Australia. But Zelensky actually came back and said, thank you for the coal.
That's really a very interesting thought. I just wanted to pick up two things. You talked about nuclear. We've got Macron currently up for his re-election in France saying, we're going to go not just for energy security, we're going for energy independence, and it's going to be nuclear-based. We have in the UK, we're going to end up with only one nuclear reactor, I think, very soon, aren't we?
I think
We've got Hinkley, which the previous Conservative government, but one, started the ball rolling on.
Labour started that.
Oh,
Tony Blair. Tony Blair announced a new age of nuclear.
Right, but
12 years ago. I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the deal was done, wasn't it, by the Cameron Osborne government? Yeah, and then renewed by
the project began in 2007 when they famously said, you're going to be cooking a Christmas turkey by 2017. It's not going to be ready until 2026, which tells you...
Which is like the cold shower.
Go and get a sandwich.
Exactly.
Is turkey acceptable to eat?
Uncooked turkey and cold shower.
Raw turkey. That doesn't sound very nice.
But my point was this. At the time, with the Cameron Osborne government, there was criticism of the price that the government had guaranteed they would pay for electricity, which I think, I looked it up earlier, £92.50 per megawatt hour. Does it look like a good deal now?
It does at the moment, but again, like cold water, you know, this is the moment of crisis. and obviously fuel prices are very high. This will be a temporary thing. There is no fundamental shortage of fossil fuels. The world will kind of reorganize itself, and there will be, power available, and so prices will fall, I think, in 2 years. Once, in time, prices are likely to fall.
But what hasn't changed, I think, just to go back, inevitably they will rise and fall, is that this concept of energy security is now front and center. I mean, just like the pandemic, put global health at the center stage and kept us from talking face to face for 2 years.
Yes.
What's happened in what Putin has done has forever reminded us that we need to really understand the consequences of our energy supply.
And it's happened at a time when, for the first time in history, there is a viable economic alternative to fossil fuels, because, as the IPCC pointed out, renewables are far cheaper than anyone expected they would be. They've fallen in unbelievable prices have tumbled. So now they are available, so often the cheapest form of energy for many countries.
Latika, while Europe agonises over what I think the mayor of one Ukrainian city called the blood money it is giving Russia by buying its oil and gas, Australia not only sending humanitarian coal but sending armoured vehicles.
Yes, Bushmasters.
Bushmasters to help the Ukrainians. Do you see anything at the moment that is going to either accelerate the end of the war or alter the direction, the trajectory of this war?
I thought it was very interesting listening to Boris Johnson and Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, who was in London today. And both of them seemed to be suggesting that we should be strapping in for a very long conflict. And they were suggesting that the sanctions would be long-term, therefore the war would be long-term. And you, pardon me, only had to listen to NATO's boss, Jens Stoltenberg, this week to say that while Russia has withdrawn from northern Ukraine now, we know that as of today, they are regrouping and refocusing on the east in the Donbass. Putin has not walked away from his ambition to own all of Ukraine. So what does that tell us? I think this is just the start of some very, very hard years ahead for Europe.
I didn't hear what Olaf Scholz said, but it just enrages me. Olaf Scholz is in no position to make these comments. I find it morally indefensible, Germany's position here, and I find it so offensive. They are more than any nation on earth fueling this war. They didn't cause it, to be clear, but 200 million euros, 220 million American dollars a day go to Moscow for the fuel that warms German homes and fuels German industry. It's so interesting that in 2009, when the euro crashed, Germany wagged its finger at Greece and said, "You were irresponsible. We're going to cut you off and you're going to pay." And their economy shrank, 20-something%? Now, oh no, we can't cut off the oil because our economy might shrink a couple of points. I mean, what hypocrisy, what moral hypocrisy. And if you look, Germans feel this. The surveys say that Germans believe that the gas should be cut off. There is a way to shorten this war, and Olaf Scholz holds the key. And yes, will it hurt his economy? Yes. But let's look at German history. Let's look at the legacy. Have you not learned, is there not a moral stance that goes ahead of 3% shrinkage of your economy for a period to stop a bloodbath? I mean, really? I think that it is outrageous that Germany said that he would say, well, we have to get used to this going on, but don't worry, BMW is still producing, Mercedes is still producing, Siemens is still producing.
I just think, as a balancing comment on Germany, I think we've got to recognise that Germany has changed its policies really quickly.
It has, but they're not cutting off. They're still sending that money.
Yeah, but they're trying to reduce. I mean, that's the problem. It's very hard to change the supply of energy in your economy. It's a huge challenge. You can't do it suddenly. I agree. There could be sacrifices made. They could say we're going to have to ration it because this is such an urgent moment.
I just don't think that washes to the people of Mariupol. I just don't think. I'm sorry. I get that there will be displacement. This is in our lifetimes the biggest humanitarian crisis in Europe, and it is indefensible to say, well, it takes time.
Can I ask you, Justin? When you look at the crimes that are alleged to have been committed in places like Bucha, other parts of Donbass, elsewhere in Ukraine, and that have been laid at the door of the Russians, just as a last thought, does that tell you anything about this war, about how it's going and about where it leaves Russia, do you think?
I think it does. I think it says. I mean, this is the huge challenge that Russia's going to face. It's going to face this. I mean, how is it ever going to come well, I mean, in the medium term, how's it going to overcome the reputational damage of these apparent war crimes that it's committed? I think it will be a huge challenge. It'll be a stain that Russia has to try and deal with for decades to come.
And what's interesting is as a journalist who's also interested in the technology, the way we are seeing this war is unlike anything before. Witness video of war crimes as they happen. He can't hide behind this.
Thank you, Geoffrey Kaufman, Latika Burke, Justin Rowlett. Thank you all very much. A terrific discussion. Thanks so much for being with us. Thank you for your company. We'll do more of the same next week. Do join us then. For all of us, goodbye.